All right, Shabbosai, let us begin. So I'm going to begin by thanking our sponsors of today's shir, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Iyar, Yona Shushie Ehrenfeld, for dedicating all the Shir and Drashos this month in loving memory of Yona's grandfather, Yosef ben Shmuel Aron. To thank Marc Karstaedt for dedicating the Shiurim this month in memory of his mother, Chana Bat Shraggai. To thank our Week of Learning sponsors, the Marowitz family, in his Chosov Refuah Shalima for Su Shulam Estova Bas Mindel, and the Grossman family as a Chosov Refuah Shalima for Miriam Chana Bas Ida. We thank all of our sponsors and hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshamas will have an aliyah, and all those who require a refuah should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. And also with that, let us begin. We have a really exciting and beautiful daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Daf Tes, and we are picking up Emirat Hashem on the bottom, actually at the two dots, on Ches Amud Beis. So we'll say going back a little bit to the Mishnah. So we'll say let's begin. So the Mishnah said as follows, quoting by the two dots, Lishkas Parhedron. So remember again, we would sequester the Kohen Gadol to a chamber, right? So we've spent the first 8 blot of this Masechta really focusing on the notion and concept of sequestering. Now we're going back a little bit more to the mechanics. What happens? So remember again, the first thing the Mishnah told me is they sequestered him to a chamber in the Beis HaMikdash, and that chamber was named the Parhedron chamber. So they would take him to the Parhedron chamber. So it says the Gemara, Lishkas Parhedron, Tanya Rabbi Huda, V'chi Lishkas Parhedron Haisa. Was it actually called the Lishkas Parhedron? Was that the name of it? V'halo Lishkas Balvati Haisa. It was named the Lishkas Balvati. They're both say, now what's the difference in these names? If you take a look at Rashi says Parhedron is Pekidi HaMelech. Parhedron actually is a name, not of a person, but of a position. So Parhedron is an officer of the king. Balvati, on the other hand, Rashi says over here, Lashon Sorim, is a Lashon of nobleman. Nobleman. So the chamber of, which is what we call Lishkas Parhedron, that means the chamber of the king's officers. But Balvati means the king's nobleman. So Balvati is a much more exalted statement than Parhedron. So the Gemara says, why would we call the Kohen Gadol's chamber Lishkas Parhedron? After all, again, we should call it Lishkas Balvati, nobleman. To which the Gemara says, you're right. In the beginning, in fact, they used to call it Lishkas Balvati, the chamber of the nobleman. But then something happened. But say this is incredible. Umitoch shenosnin alav mamon lekehuna. Umachlifin also kol shnei masar chodesh keparhet. Supposed to listen to this. But then something happened, and we'll expound on this a bit more on Daf Tes. During the second temple era, during the second Beis HaMikdash, the office of the Kahuna Gedola was sold to the highest bidder. And as a result, you had a number of people who were totally unfit for office, yet occupied that office. So interestingly enough, what ended up happening, there was an incredible amount of turnover. And I was like, why was there turnover? I guess you could call it early retirement, right? How so? Because they would go into the Kodesh HaKadoshim on Yom Kippur, and they would not come out. They would not come out. So there was an incredible amount of turnover. Now something very interesting happened. As soon as the Kohen Gadol would come into power, what was the first order of business? He would remodel the Lishkas Balvati, right? That's my chamber. I'm the Kohen Gadol. He would remodel the Lishkas Balvati. So every 12 months, there would be a huge remodeling of the Lishkas Balvati. But so if you take a look at Rashi says over here, Mitoch shenostin mamon lekehuna, Mitoch shekohani bayeshini hayu omdin ayidei mamon, shenostin al kuna gedola lemalchus beis chashmonai. So we'll discuss this in greater depth in the next daf. But remember again, Second Temple era, remember again, you had, at least for some period of that, the Hasmonean kings, right? After the Chanukah story, the Chashmonaim, who were Kohanim, took over the Kahuna. Well, they didn't take over, they were Kohanim, but they also took over the Melucha. They also took over the monarchy. Machlokes Rambam and the Ramban, as to whether or not that was the right move or not. But either way, there unfortunately was a downward spiral. The Kohen Gedolah was sold off to the highest bidder, and therefore Rashi says, "Machlifin osa kol yud beis chodesh kilomar shereshayim hayu." The Kohen Gedolah were reshayim, v'lo hayu motziin shnasan, and they would not live out the year. Uma'amidim achar tachtov v'chol kohen hamischadesh ba soser oso bona binyan noam min arishon shetekruya al shmo V'nimtzas mischalefes kol shana b'shana. So therefore, I will say every Kohen Gadol would come into power, would redo the lishkas balvati. He would redo it. So it became a little bit like a joke. So what happened? They made a joke that the Kohanim Gedolim turned over like the Parhedrin. Rabbi said the Parhedrin are the appointed officials of the king. So they would serve a year and there would be turnover. So what used to be called the Lishkas Balvati, which was again the Lishka, the chamber of the nobleman, became known as the Lishkas Parhedrin. Right, the Parhedrin meaning the servants of the king, right, the attendants of the king, whose positions often turned over every year, just like the Kohanim Gedolim turned over every year. So the Gemara says, Lefichach hayukorin also lishkas parhedrin. So amazingly enough, again, in the beginning it was called lishkas balvati, the chamber of the nobleman. But then when there was such high turnover amongst the Kohanim Gedolim, because clearly they were unfit for the office, it became known simply as the lishkas parhedrin, the attendants of the king, who turn over each and every year. So the Gemara goes weiter. Tanan Hasam. So we'll say the Gemara just now brings another example of the use of this word parhedrin. So Tanan Hasam hanachtumin lo chayvu osen chacham lahafish ala chumas meiser v'chala. So we'll also listen to this. Nachtumin are bakers. These are commercial bakers, right? Or bakers, bakers who provide bread to the general populace. So we'll say, what happens if you have a baker who himself is a chaver Talmid Chacham, but he purchases flour from an Amma Aretz? So Rabbi, remember again, in general, if you purchase produce from an Amma Aretz, what's the status of that produce? What's the status? Demai. So what do you have to do with demai? You have to retithe it. So there's a special takana by the bakers that halacha l'maisa, when they purchase demai flour, all they have to do is separate out Trumas Meiser and Chala. They don't have to separate all the other tithes. So Bishlam and Truma Gidololo, I understand why the bakers don't have to separate out what we call Truma Gidola. What's it? Truma Gidol is Truma, the portion for the coin. Why? Disanya top of test, Lefisha Shalach B'chol Gvula Yisrael. Because this is very interesting. Who was the one who introduced the legislation regarding Demai? It was none other than Yochanan Kohen Gadol, who we will discuss. So Yochanan Kohen Gadol during the Second Temple era goes ahead and kind of looks at what's going on in general Klal Yisrael. He's the one who saw, Yochanan Kohen Gadol was the one who saw that general Amaratzim, general unlearned people, were only separating out Truma Gidola, which is the primary tithe. That's all they were separating out. They weren't separating out any other tithes. See, he came along and said, therefore, if you purchase produce from an Amma Aretz, you have to retithe it. But interestingly enough, that never required one to take Truma Gidola. Why not? Because Truma Gidola was always being taken. So I understand why the bakers don't have to take Truma Gidola. So Umaiser Rishon, Umaiser Aninami, lo, Hamotzi Mechaver Lavaraya. Furthermore, you also can't obligate a person to separate out Maiser Rishon and Maiser Ani from their demai as well. Why not, Rabbosai? Because interestingly enough, remember, Maiser Rishon goes to the Levi. Maiser Ani goes to the pauper. We'll say, if that obligation, remember, when you purchase produce from an Amma Aretz, it's a suffix. Did the Amma Aretz tithe it or not? So we'll say, in general, the halacha says, if you want to extract money from someone, the burden of proof rests upon who? The extractor. So, therefore, we'll say, if I purchase produce from an Amma Aretz, maybe he tithed, maybe he didn't tithe it. So, therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, if the ani wants to claim that Meiser ani wasn't separated, the burden of proof rests upon the ani. If the Levi wants to prove that Meiser Rishon wasn't separated from it, the burden of proof rests upon the ani. Now we'll say, I know what you're thinking. You could say again, well, by Truma and Truma Gidola, remember again, there is no problem, because remember, even Amei Aretz, even ignorant people were in fact taking Truma Gidola. Ella Meiser Sheni Nifreshu V'Nisko V'Nichlinu B'Yerushalayim. But why not just obligate the baker to separate out Meiser Sheni and eat it in Yerushalayim? Because what's the beauty of Meiser Sheni? What's the beauty of it? It's yours, right? Remember again, Meiser Sheni is yours. The only caveat is you have to go ahead and eat it in Yerushalayim. So why not just obligate them to do that? Amra Ula, because we also listen to this, because the bakers had a problem. What was the problem of the bakers? Amra Ula, mitoch sheparhedrin halalu choftin osan kol yud beis chodesh va'omrim lahen michru bizol. So we'll say, listen to this. The Ula said, Because the Parhedrin, we'll say, who are the Parhedrin? They are the officers of the king. The officers of the king would often force the bakers to sell at a significant discount. They would force the bakers to keep their price low. Therefore, lo achechinu rabbanon. Therefore, the rabbis did not compel the nachtumim, the bakers, to separate out ma'aser sheni and take it to Yerushalayim. So we'll say, so pretty much what's happening over here is the rabbis had compassion on the bakers because the bakers had a difficult life because there was price fixing. Who did the price fixing? It was the king's officials. They forced the bakers to keep the prices low. Therefore, when the bakers bought flour from an Amma Aretz, technically, again, that flour is Demai. So again, they don't have to separate out Truma Gedola. Why? Because the Amma Aretz separate out Truma Gedola. Meiser Rishon, Meiser Ani, Hamotzi Mechavera Alav Haraya. Why not obligate them to separate out Meiser Sheni and take it to Yerushalayim? Because they had compassion. They had compassion upon the bakers. But why is this being brought down over here? Only because the Brisa uses the word Parhedrin. Right? So what do you see from this context over here? That Parhedrin are officers of the king. They're officers of the king. My Parhedrin. What are Parhedrin? Parsi. Parhedrin are Parsi. And again, last Rashi and Daf Parsi. Pikidi HaMelech. Officers of the king. Sefer will say to come full circle. The reason this was called Lishkas Parhedrin, that was not its original name. Originally, it was called Lishkas Balvati, the chamber of the nobleman, reflecting the exalted and lofty level of the position of the Kahuna Gedola. But in the Bayishin, in the Second Temple era, when the position of the Kahuna Gedola was often sold to the highest bidder, and the chamber was remade year after year, because Kohanim Gedola would die every single Yom Kippur because they were unfit for the position, it became like a joke. So to call it the Lishkas Balvati, the chamber of the nobleman, would have been inappropriate. Instead, they called it Lishkas Parhedrin. This is the chamber of the king's workers, right? The king's appointees. Those were positions that changed every year, just like the Kahuna Gedola changed every year. Incredible. We'll say the Gemara goes weiter. Amar Rav Bar Bachana Rabbi Yochanan. We'll say very profound pasuk. Or very profound piece. My dichsiv yiras Hashem tosif yamim v'shano. Sorry, tosif yamim. What does it mean when it says fear of Hashem will add days? Ushnos rishon tikatzrena. But the years of the wicked will be truncated. So what does that mean? Yiras Hashem tosif yomim. When it says fear of Hashem will add days, zeh mikdash rishon. This refers to the first Beis HaMikdash. Let's listen to this. Sha'amad arba meos ve'eser shanim. The first Beis HaMikdash stood for 410 years. That was the duration of the Bayis Rishon. V'lo shimshu bo ela yurches kohanim gedolim. Well, say, isn't this incredible? 410 years of the Bayis Rishon, and in 410 years, only 18 Kohanim Gedolim. Only 18 Kohanim Gedolim. Listen to this. Ushnosu sham tekatzrena. But then it says the years of the wicked will be truncated. Zem miktasheni. This refers to the second Beis HaMikdash. Sha'amar dalid meos re'esim shana. Both say the second Beis HaMikdash stood for 10 years longer. Right? First Beis HaMikdash 410 years. Second Beis HaMikdash 420 years. And get ready for this. V'shimshu bo yoser mishlosh me'os kohanim. More than 300 kohanim. You hear this? First Beis HaMikdash 410 years, 18 kohanim gedolim. Second Beis HaMikdash 420 years, more than 300 kohanim gedolim. Now it gets worse. Tsemehem mem shana sheshimei Shimon HaTzadik. Now both say, remember again, you have to remove from that, remember Shimon HaTzadik, both say, who was Mishiyare Anshik Knesses Hagidola, right? He was a tzaddik. See, he was a Kohen Gadol during the Second Temple era for more than 40 years. Ushmonim Sheshimei Yochanan Kohen Gadol. And remember again, 80 years that Yochanan Kohen Gadol, who was also a great tzaddik, was Kohen Gadol. Eser Sheshimei Shishmael ben Pachi. 10 years that Yishmael ben Pachi was the Kohen Gadol. So we'll say, so remember again, you already have 130 years from those three. 130 years from those three. Va'amri Yud Aleph Sheshimei Shabbalazah ben Charson. And some say there was another 11 years that Elazar ben Charson was the Kohen Gadol. So both say, so remember again, you could have between 130 and 141 years made up of 4 righteous Kohanim Gedolim. Which I will say tells you what? Mikan ve'elech tzei v'chashiv. Go and do the math. Kol echad ve'echad lo hotzi shnaso. Both say when you do the math, you begin to see an incredibly tragic turnover rate. That Kohanim Gedolim did not live out the year. There are multiple Kohanim Gedolim who served for less than a year. What happened? What happened was Yom Kippur happened, right? What happened ultimately again is that the Kohen Gadol would enter into the Kodesh HaKadosh and was unfit and therefore would die. I will say, which tells you something. I will say, think about this just a moment. Isn't it incredible, right? Think about this. Okay, so you have money, Baruch Hashem, and you always wanted to be the Kohen Gadol. Fantastic. Say buy the position. I will say, if I did that, what would you do Yom Kippur morning? Call in sick. Simple. Call in sick. I'm going to take this as a personal day, right? People do this on Shabbos all the time, right? I'm going to take it as a personal day, right? I'm going to call in sick, right? I'll say, isn't it incredible? What does it tell you? It shows you the power of gaiva. It shows you, I will say, how overwhelming the midah of arrogance is. That when a person possesses gaiva, when a person possesses arrogance, it allows you to live with a sense of cognitive dissonance. It allows you to divorce yourself from reality. It allows you to live in such a state of delusion. And I will say arrogance manifests itself in a variety of ways. Arrogance, some people have arrogance because of their money. Some people are arrogant just because they think the world revolves around them. Everything is about them. But when you do that, when you live life with gaiva blinds you to anything and everything, even the obvious. You're coming on the heels. Last year's Kohen Gadol died, the year before he died, the year before he died, the year before he died. You get the point, right? They're dying, one after another. I will say, and it's not the pshat that, notice the stress of the job. Some jobs are stressful. I will say, like the Gemara says, the Navi says, that Shmuel HaNavi was zakin babayom. Shmuel HaNavi was old. But you know how old Shmuel HaNavi was when he died? He was 52 years old. 52 years old when he died. So there are jobs, like leading Klal Yisrael, that age people prematurely. So you could say maybe it was the Kuna Gedola also. They may say, when everybody's dying on the same day, and you're after the same avoda, come on. Hence the power of gaiva. Gaiva, which I will say is why, conversely, we place so much emphasis on the midah of anava, of humbling ourselves. Because again, if you don't have anava, you have gaiva. It's like the only place you could be parav in life is your kitchen. There's no parav outside of your kitchen. You're either a bal gaiva or you're a bal anava. That's the way it works in life. It's an incredible Gemara. Amri Yochanan ben Tursa. Mipnei machar v'shilo. Why was Shiloh destroyed? I will say again, so Shiloh, remember, was the site of the Mishkan, where the Mishkan stood for 369 years. So why was Shiloh destroyed? Mipnei shahayu ba shnei devarim. Because we'll say there are two averos happening by Shiloh. Or really, it doesn't mean two averos in Shiloh, it means two averos in Klal Yisrael occurring during that time. What were the two averos? Gilei arayos bizayon kachim. There was immorality and general disrespect of sacrifices, of sacrificial items, of karbanos. Where do we see this? We'll say, Gila Rayas T'chsiv, Ve'eli Zakin Ma'od Eli. We'll say, remember again, Eli was the Kohen Gadol in Shiloh. This is in the beginning of Sefer Shmuel. Eli was the Kohen Gadol in Shiloh. And what happens? He was very old. V'shama Eis Asher Yasun Banav L'chol Yisrael. And remember again, Eli's sons, Chafni and Pinchas, unfortunately abused their power. And Eli heard everything that Chafni and Pinchas were doing. Ve'es asher yishkavun as hanoshim hatzovos beis oel moed. And Eli heard everything that his sons Chafni and Pinchas were doing, all the ra. And he also heard that, literally translated, they slept with the women at the oel moed, at the Mishkan. Va'afagav d'amr Shmuel bar Nachmani amar Rabbi Yochanan. And we'll say, even though again the Gemara says that no, it doesn't literally mean they slept with the women. And whoever says that they committed an act of immorality is mistaken. Rather, what did they do? Ella, this is the Gemara says, Ella toah mitoch, amud beis, mitoch, shesho eskinehen, miha ma'ale alein akasav kilu shachvom. So we'll say, interestingly enough, so the pasuk says that Chafni and Pinchas went ahead and slept with the women. So even if you go with the opinion that it's not literal, they didn't sleep with the women, so what did they do? I will say, when women came after childbirth to go ahead and offer up their karbanos, Chafni and Pinchas took their time. They didn't offer it up, and as a result, women often had to stay over in Shiloh. So remember again, I will say, bringing a karban is the last step in a woman's tara after childbirth, which allows her then to be with her husband. The fact that ultimately they kept women overnight in Shiloh and didn't allow them to go back to their husbands was treated as an act of immorality. So whether it's that Chafni and Pinchas literally engaged in immorality, or is that Chafni and Pinchas unfortunately delayed the offering of karbanos and kept women from their husband, it's treated like an act of immorality. So you see from here that Shiloh was destroyed ultimately again because of immorality. Next. Bizaron Kachim. What does it mean that halacha lamaisa again they disrespected Kachim? So the Gemara says, just trying to figure this out here. They disrespected Kachim, so the Gemara says D'chsev gam b'terev yaktirna sachelev. So we'll say here, let me explain to you. Let's read this. Gam b'terev yaktirna sachelev. Even before the chelev. Remember again, the chelev is a sacrificial fat that's offered up on the mizbeach. So even before the chelev was offered, Uba nar hakohen, so an attendant of the Kohanim, a servant of Chafni and Pinchas, would come along. V'amar li ish hazoveach, and he would say to the person who was offering the karban, Uba li ish hazoveach, v'amar li ish hazoveach, tinei basar litzlos lekohen. Give meat for the kohen to roast. V'lo yikach mimcha basar mavushal, and he won't take cooked meat, kiyim basar, kiyim chai, raw meat. So we'll say what would end up happening over here is as follows. The halacha is that the kohen gets a portion of certain karbanos. But when does the kohen get his portion? Only after the chelev has been offered. Right? Once the chelev has been offered, then halacha lamaisa the kohen gets his portion. What would happen? Chafni and Pinchas would send their attendant to go ahead and take the sacrificial piece, or sacrificial parts, kohanic parts, before the chelev was offered. And the Jews would say to the attendant, listen, let us just offer up the chelev. And then the Kohen could take whatever he wants. But they were so greedy. The Gemara says, let's just offer up the chelev. And then the Kohen, Chafni and Pinchas, they could take whatever they want. Va'amar lo, no. Give me the meat now. Ve'im lo lakachti b'chazaka. And if you don't give me what I want, I'm going to take it anyway. Vatichatas hana'arim gedola ma'odes p'nei Hashem. So we'll say, interestingly enough, remember, they were so greedy that they couldn't even wait for the chelev to be offered. So the Jews were saying, you could take whatever you want. Let's just go through the proper sacrificial channels. Let's do this correctly. But they were so profoundly greedy that they could not wait to take their kohanic portion until after the chelev was. And we'll say, now I want to point out, it's all the same thing. Right? So we'll say, it's all... What you begin to see is, both by the Kana Gadol and by Yesheni and by Shiloh, it's all the same gaiva. See, I will say, gaiva, when a person is arrogant, what happens? Everything becomes about me. So therefore, when a person is arrogant, that leads to arayas. Right? Why does it lead to arayas? Why does it lead to arayas? It leads to arayas because we'll say, what's arayas? What's immorality? Immorality is saying, life is all about my pleasure. Life is all about my pleasure. That's what it's about. Whatever is going to make me feel good is necessary, important, and should be permitted. Same thing here with the meat. Why can't you just wait 2 minutes? Just let them offer up the chelev. Because Gaiva says, I should have what I want, and I should have it now. So it's incredible. It's the same thing by the Kohanim of the Bayis Sheni. It's the same thing with Chafni and Pinchas. Just a profound gaiva, a profound egocentricity that is a derivative of unchecked arrogance. Profoundly tragic. Mikdash Rishon mipnei machar. We'll say these are. I forgot. I meant to send out on the WhatsApp chat last night that incredible, riveting, overwhelming, transformative, cathartic Gemaras. But I forgot. So it says the Gemara as follows: Mikdash Rishon mipnei macharav. Now we'll say, why was the first Beis Hamikdash destroyed? Mipnei gimel dvarim shoyba, because of 3 averos which were committed in the Beis Hamikdash, or when I say committed in the Beis Hamikdash, meaning committed societally. What were they? Avodah Zarah, Gilei Arayos, Shlichus Damim, idolatry, immorality, and bloodshed. So we'll say the 3 cardinal sins, the 3 cardinal averos. 3 cardinal averos. The Gemara says, now let's analyze. So Avodah Zarah, where do we see Avodah Zarah? D'chsev ki katzar matzeh mihishtareya. So literally means the couch was too short to stretch out on. What does that mean? My katzar matzah mishtareya. Am Rabbi Yochanan katzar matzah zeh Hamishtara alav shnei reim ke'echad. The couch was too narrow, was too short for two friends to lay down on. We'll say, who are the two friends? The Ribono Shel Olam and the Avodah Zarah, the idol that King Menashe introduced into the Beis HaMikdash. So we'll say the idea being was that the Jews introduced idolatry, and therefore there wasn't enough room, right? There wasn't not enough theological room for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as well as the Avodah Zarah. V'amasecha Sarah ki his kanes. So the Gemara says, Amar Shlomo Nachmani kimati Rabbi Yonasan lahaikra. Whenever Rabbi Yonasan would come to this pasuk, bachi, he would cry, Amar man dichsiv bei, the God about who it said, kones kaned me hayom, the one who's supposed to be referring to Har Sinai, that literally he gathers mounds of water. Naasislo masechat tzara. An idol became his rival. So we'll say it's tragic because we'll say what happened. Again, this in general is always fascinating. The concept of idolatry, especially historically when there is such a clear divine manifestation. Whether again it's earlier by Yam Suf or whether it's by Bayis Rishon, but again this was the Avodah Zarah. So we'll say, interestingly enough, I want to point out that often throughout our history, when we had challenges with idolatry, so it wasn't necessarily that idolatry meant the rejection of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in favor for another God. But in fact, what happened more often than not was something that's called shituf. Shituf means, I believe in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but what? I believe in other things as well. And you see this often. Rarely was like an active repudiation of the Ribono Shel Olam in favor of another deity. Instead, there was the worship of another deity in conjunction with the Ribono Shel Olam. So the Gemara, which I will say, by the way, is interestingly enough, I've always thought about this, not our topic, but it's interesting to think about like kind of which is worse. Which is worse to a certain degree. Is it worse? And I know this sounds strange. It's all bad. I want to go on record as saying Avodah Zarah, bad. Right? So I'll say, but again, interestingly enough, is shituf worse? Is it worse to worship HaKadosh Baruch Hu in conjunction with another idol? Or is it worse just to totally reject HaKadosh Baruch Hu and embrace the idol? I think it's interesting thing to, again, it's all bad, but I think is a fascinating idea that sometimes you see in the Nevi'im, where HaKadosh Baruch Hu gets so upset at the notion of shituf. Why? Because Rabbi said, in life, you have to choose a side. Right? You have to choose a side. You have to stand for something. I say this is like the big thing, right? We live in a society where now, everything is geared to make everyone happy, right? Everything is supposed to be a big tent. Well, if you're everything for everyone, then in reality you're nothing for no one, right? So you have to stand for something. So it's interesting that sometimes the concept of shituf, where I believe in everything. I believe in Chashon Baruch, I believe in this. So to a certain degree, that's worse than being an Oved Avodah Zarah. Because at least if I'm an Oved Avodah Zarah, I believe in this, right? This is my God, right? That chair, that's the God. Okay, at least you're a chair guy. At least you know your principled individual believes in something. Masha'enke, you believe in this, you believe in this. What do you believe in? What are you? Just something interesting to ponder. Anyway, the Gemara says as follows. Gilei Arayos. So now we've established that there was Avodah Zarah in the Bayis Rishon. Gilei Arayos, immorality, dichsiv, Vayomer Hashem, was a very profound Gemara. Vayomer Hashem. So the Gemara, we're quoting the pasuk from Yeshayahu. Vayomer Hashem, Ya'an ki gafu b'nos Tzion. So literally going to say the daughters of Tzion have become very arrogant. Vatilachna nituyos garan. They walk with an outstretched neck. We'll define each of the pieces of this pasuk. Umeshakros einayim literally means with wandering or really with lying eyes. Haloch v'tafov telachna. They walk like they're floating. Uberaglein te'akasna. And they anger with their feet. Ya'an ki gafu b'nos Tzion. So let's analyze. Let's break apart the pasuk. What does it mean? Ya'an ki gafu b'nos Tzion. That literally again it means they became arrogant. But if you translate it literally, it means they became very tall. Gavoa. The daughters of Tzion became very tall. Shemahalchos aruka b'tzad kitzara. So what would happen? A tall woman would dafka walk next to a shorter woman. Now what do you do when a tall person walks next to a shorter person? It amplifies their height. So a taller woman who wanted to catch the attention of men would dafka walk next to someone who was shorter in order that she should catch more attention. Aruka b'tzad kitzara. V'teilachnu netiyos gar. So we'll say what the Gemara is describing over here is that, unfortunately, the Jewish women, there was a fundamental lack of tznius. There was a fundamental lack of modesty. But not just a lack of modesty, as we're going to see, almost like an active immorality. What happens? Vatelachnu netioskar, and they walked with an outstretched neck. Shamahalchos becomes a kufa. So that means to walk with an erect posture, which again, to walk in a more gaivadik way. Umeshakros einayim. What does it mean again with lying eyes? They would put on an incredible amount of eye makeup. We'll say all again to intentionally attract the attention of men. Haloch v'tafov telachna. They would walk like they were floating. They would walk again. We'll say literally means the heel by the big toe. They would take very small steps again in order to be noticed. Uberagla teakasna. And what does it mean again? With their feet, they would anger. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak shemevios mar vafarson. This is very interesting. They would take myrrh and balsam, umanicham ma'alehen, and they would put it in their shoes. Ukishemagios eitzel bachura Yisrael. And when they would come next to the young Jewish men, boatos, they would stamp on their shoes, and what that would do is that would release the perfume of the myrrh and the balsam. Umatizos alehen. Umachnisin bahem yitzhara ka'aras. Or ba'aras bekas. We'll say what would happen. So purposely, when they would go ahead and walk by the young Jewish men, they would stamp on their feet, release the perfume, and entice the men. And literally it says that the yitzhara would enter into the men like the venom of a snake. So also you see over here, ultimately again, the notion of gilarayos, immorality. Which will say something very interesting, by the way. If you notice, the immorality being described over here, we'll say the pasuk doesn't describe anything that actually happened, right? But what does it describe? It describes ultimately, again, a behavior in a way that's meant to entice. Now, I want to go on record and say something very important. The pasuk over here, right, is laying the blame on the women. Right? It's saying that the women acted. So remember again, a woman is not allowed to act in an immodest fashion. But on the same token, a man is obligated to guard his eyes and to watch himself. It's always easy to blame that she enticed. So again, it's a dual responsibility. A woman has an obligation, a Jewish woman has an obligation to act in a modest fashion that is not provocative. But if a man becomes enticed, you can't blame that on the woman. A man also has an obligation to watch what he looks at, to watch his behaviors, to guard a certain sense of morality. But again, what's fascinating about this, Abosai, is that pasuk itself is not describing any type of act of immorality, which tells you, Abosai, something absolutely amazing. That immorality and morality, it's not just about a sexual act. Morality and immorality is about how a society conducts itself, how people dress, what people look at, how people generally behave. And there was a fundamental breakdown in all of these areas, which, although the pasuk doesn't say it, must have led ultimately to active immorality as well. Shlichos damim, what about murder? Tichsev v'gam dam noki shafach menash harbe me'od. Also, this one's pretty explicit, right? Menashe shed much blood until Yerushalayim was filled with blood from one end to the next. Shabbos said the first Beis Hamikdash is destroyed because of the commission of the three cardinal sins: Gileraya, Shlichus Damavol, Zara, immorality, bloodshed, and idolatry. Mikdashini, Shabbos says this Gemara. But Mikdashini, Shayu Oskin Batorah Mitzvah Signilas Chasodin, Nei Macharav. So we'll say this is quite fascinating. But what about the second Beis Hamikdash? So second Beis Hamikdash, everybody's learning Torah, everybody's doing mitzvahs, everybody's performing acts of chesed. So interestingly enough, you see, as corrupt as the Kahuna Gedola was, apparently the general spiritual state of affairs was pretty okay. It was pretty okay. So there's no avodah zarah girai shlichus dam ba'yesheni. They're learning Torah, doing chesed. So what's going on? Mipnei macharav. Here we go. Mipnei shahaisa bo sinas chinam. I will say because there was sinas chinam, baseless hatred, which tells you l'lamdecha sheshkula sinas chinam kineged shalosh averos, which tells us that sinas chinam, baseless hatred, is as terrible as the three cardinal sins: avodah zarah, Isn't that absolutely incredible? First Beis Hamikdash is destroyed because Avodah Zarah, Gilarei Shvichus Damim. Second Beis Hamikdash, they're learning Torah, they're doing Chesed, they're performing mitzvos. So why was the Beis Hamikdash destroyed? Sinas Chinam. Now I will say just one word about this. We're all familiar with this. This is not a chiddush to us. So I will say it's always. I was very interesting. Sinas Chinam means baseless hatred. So very often, how do we understand that? People just hated each other. And I will say that never happens, right? When people hate each other, it's always for what? There's always a reason. Now, it might be a bad reason, or it might be a really like an illegitimate reason. But there's no such thing as baseless hatred. No such thing as people just hating themselves for no reason. So we'll say, interestingly enough, so it's brought down in some of the Svarim, that the notion of sinas chinam means as follows. Chinam really means without responsibility. So what's sinas chinam? Sinas chinam means where there's sinah, there's animosity, and no one takes responsibility to fix the frayed relationships. See, Rabbi said, animosity always happens, right? Fallouts always happen. Relationships are always in a state of disrepair. But at the end of the day, generally what happens with frayed relationships is someone's got to take the ownership to repair it. Now, by the way, repairing it can mean different things. Repairing it might mean, you know what? We can't be friends. or we have to have a distance. But that's okay. That's also a form of repair. I don't let it dangle. You stay there. I'll stay here. You should be matzliach. I should be matzliach. But it's not healthy for us to interact. But again, sinas china means that there's sinah and no one takes responsibility to try to fix it. No one takes responsibility to try to go ahead and figure out what to do with this. That's when society disintegrates. When no one takes responsibility over the discord. When no one, and we'll say, by the way, I'm not going to get political now. Right, but again, you see this in societies. You see the disintegration of fabric of society when there's discord, there's problems, and no one wants to take ownership or no one wants to assign ownership of the problems that occur. There leads to a fundamental unraveling of the fabric of society. More to say on that, but I will say that at a different time. So also the Gemara says, Rishayim hayu, ela shetalu b'tchonim ba'akadosh baruch hu. Ultimately, interesting enough, by Bayesheni, they were Rishayim, but interestingly enough, they believed in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So we'll say, remember again, as opposed to Bayes Rishon, where there was a problem with Avodah Zarah, there was no problem with Avodah Zarah during Bayesheni. We'll say, isn't this fascinating? Theologically, they were pretty okay. There was really no idolatry during the Second Temple era. I mean, in the Beis Hamikdash, they were Rishayim. They were bad, but they believe in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So we'll say, now we're going to see, there's a discussion exactly about what this phrase applies to. This phrase of Rishayim Hayu, they were wicked, but they believed in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is that a reference to First Temple or Second Temple? So Asan Mikdash Rishon, the Gemara says, perhaps it refers to Mikdash Rishon. Dichsiv, Rasha b'shochad yishpotu, Korneh b'mechir yoru, Univiyah b'kesef yaksomu, va'al Hashem yishon lemor, halo Hashem b'kebein lo sava alon ra'ah. So the pasuk says, literally again, right? Their leaders judged with bribery. Their kohanim threw a price, paskin halacha. Their prophets prophesied with money, but yet they depended on HaKadosh Baruch Hu to say nothing bad will happen to us because the Ribono Shel Olam is in our midst. Lefichach hevi aleina HaKadosh Baruch Hu gimel gezeros kineged gimel averos shebiyadam. Therefore, HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought about 3 judgments corresponding to the 3 averos. Shneimar lochin biglalchem Tzion sada techrash. Tzion will become a plowed field. V'Yerushalayim ien tia, Yushalayim will become ruins. V'harabayis lebamos yar. And Harabayis will turn into a forest. High places will turn into a forest. But is that true in the first place? Hamikdash there was no sinas chinam. So what the way the Gemara makes it sound like is Bayis Rishon Gilarayos Avodah Zarah Shvichos Damim. Bayis Sheni sinas chinam, baseless hatred. Is that true? That in Bayis Rishon there was no baseless hatred? The pasuk says Megurei al Charaf Hayu Esami Lachin Sipok al Yarach. So Amar Elazar Elu b'nei Adam Sha'ochlin v'shosin zemzeh. This pasuk refers to people who dine with each other. V'dokrin zed zed b'charavo shebelashonam. And yet they stab each other with the swords of their tongue. So we'll say, so the Navi here is describing people who exhibit outward friendship to one another, but then stab each other in the back. So we'll say, is that not the greatest example of sinas chinam? Right? We'll say, and that's the most disingenuous thing. You pretend like you're someone's friend, but then when they're not listening or they're not around, you talk about them, you stab them in the back. To which the Gemara, this is bias rishon, which would seem to indicate to us that there was a problem with sinas chinam bias rishon as well. To which the Gemara says, no, hahi b'nisi yisrael ha'b'dichsev. Ultimately, again, that was actually talking about the leaders. In bias rishon, there was a problem with sinas chinam, but who's sinas chinam? Amongst the leadership. It was not a problem in the populace, just the leadership. T'chsev, zog v'hila ben adam, ki aisa ba'ami. V'tanya zog v'hila ben adam, yochol lakol, talmud lomar hi, b'chol nisi yisrael. So we'll say, really fascinating. So apparently, in Bayis Sheni, in Second Temple era, the sinas chinam ultimately, again, was amongst the general populace. In Bayis Rishon, the sinas chinam was limited to the leadership. Rabbi Yochanan bar Elazar Tarvayu Rishonim sheniskala avonim niskala kiyitim. So what is incredible? Rabbi Yochanan bar Elazar say in the first Beis Hamikdash, where their sin was revealed, right? To both say, because remember when the sin was revealed, because the Navi tells us what their averos were. We saw this the psukim, right? Remember again by Bayis Rishon, how do we know what they did wrong? The Navi tells us Gil Arayos Shvichos Damim Avodah Zarah, because their sin was revealed. Ultimately, again, niskala kitzam. The end of their galus was revealed as well. Right? The say by Bayis Rishon, we're told that when the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, the diaspora would last for 70 years. However, achronim shalom niskala avonam, but by the Bayis Sheni, where their sin was not revealed. In other words, say, remember, how do we know that the Bayis Sheni was destroyed because of sinas chinam? How do we know that? Yoma daf tesam beis, because the Gemara tells us. The Gemara tells us Masorah, but the pasuk doesn't reveal it. Therefore, lo niskala kitzam. Therefore, both say again, Geula remains unrevealed as well. So the sin was unrevealed, and therefore again, Geula remains unrevealed. So both say this is actually pretty incredible. So Rashi, that's the way I read it to you is the Parsha Pshat. Rashi understands this a little bit differently. Rashi says sheniskala avonam. Rashi says over here. Shalo hayu mechasen pisheim niskalu kitzam lefi melos lebavel shivim shana achronim shon niskala avonim b'nei mikdash sheni rishon hebeseises. We'll say Rashi understands it as follows: in the first Beis Hamikdash era, the Jews sinned openly and publicly. Therefore, because they sinned openly and publicly, their redemption is open and public as well. Kadosh Baruch Hu says explicitly, "You'll be redeemed in 70 years." In the second Beis Hamikdash era, we sinned privately. Because we sinned privately, therefore what? The Geula, quote unquote, remains private and unrevealed as well. So this is actually quite fascinating. What's a greater level, so to speak, to sin publicly or privately? So I'll say this is pretty incredible. So the Gemara seems to say, sinning publicly is better than sinning privately. Now, listen to the end of this sentence very carefully. Right? They'll say, what this means is as follows. When a person sins publicly, at least what they're saying is, I don't care what anyone thinks. I don't care about God, I don't care about people. When a person sins privately, then what they're saying is, I care about people, I just don't care about God. Now I will say, I want to tell you something interesting. There's a counter-argument to that as well. The counter-argument, the Gemara says, for example, we're actually going to see this Gemara. The Gemara says, we started Masechtas Brachos. The Gemara says, if a person has a taiva, person has a desire that he cannot go ahead and overcome, what should he do? Yilbash chorim, wear black clothing, go somewhere that no one knows you, and do what you have to do. Now the Gemara is not encouraging that, but rather what the Gemara is saying is that sometimes, if you can't overcome particular Yetzer Hara, do damage control. And damage control means if you have to sin, but sin in a way in which you limit the fallout. One of the ways in which you limit the fallout is go somewhere no one knows you. So just want to point out, but from a theological perspective, the way the Gemara is understanding it over here is in Bayis Rishon, they didn't care about anything. So fine, you didn't put the covet of man above the covet of God. That's a mailah. In Second Temple era, they equated, right? They put the covet of man above the covet of God. So they would sin in front of God, but they wouldn't sit in front of their fellow man. So the Gemara said, we'll have to stop over. We'll pick up in Mirat Hashem with this Bayis Rishon, Bayis Sheni. We'll say incredible Gemaras that continue Mirat Hashem into tomorrow as well. So tomorrow, more incredible Gemara Bayis Rishon, Bayis Sheni, Mirat Hashem to be continued. Shkoyach.